This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. A venturesome minority will always be eager to set off on their own, and no obstacles should be placed in their path. Let them take risks. For God's sake, let them get lost, sunburnt, stranded, drowned, eaten by bears, buried alive under avalanches. That is the right and privilege of any free American. Edward Abbey. The National Park System of the United States of America is one of the greatest achievements of our nation. Full stop. It should be the most important achievement that we're celebrated for around the world and in future histories. It should be the most important thing we as Americans celebrate ourselves. Forget liberal democracy. Forget the unleashing of the atomic bomb. I'll definitely forget that one. Forget our quote-unquote glorious triumphs in various apocalyptic wars. Forget cars and the iPhone and TVs and heck, even air conditioning. The most important thing America should be known for is the protection and celebration of our God-given land. I mean, we live in the Garden of Eden. Have you been out in the forest recently? To the coast? To the mountains? Besides a brief attempt at creating a preserve in the entire northern Pacific Ocean by the Russian Empire in the 1800s, which they did once they realized they were decimating the seal populations almost to extinction, besides that brief attempt, the United States of America was the first nation to set aside lands for the use of the public. But not just for use, also for protection. Protection from overgrazing, from mining, deforestation, and poaching. Protection from development. The national parks were created to protect our incredibly important soil and land and everything on it from the encroachment of modernity, capitalism, and those that desired endless growth, no matter the cost. But if you've been to a national park recently, you know the NPS has a problem. Well, it has a few problems. The main problem being the absolute overcrowded state of them. Another problem is the bloated bureaucracy and its penchant for protecting the land a little too much. If the current trajectory of the NPS continues, more and more public land will become more and more inaccessible to the public, while at the same time taking more land from said public. But all is not lost. We have the means to fix what I see as one of the greatest tragedies that we are living through. And if you're living right now, there are a lot of those. But to me, right now, Thomas Wayne Riley, who runs a website and a podcast about the beauty of not just the American Southwest, but also of the American West in general, I believe the degradation of the NPS and our public land is something we must fix before it's too late. But again, it is not yet too late. Come explore with me in this episode as I talk about the history of the parks before I attempt to diagnose and complain about some of the problems. And then ultimately, I will offer possible solutions to these problems that are plaguing America's greatest institution, the National Park Service. In the year of our Lord, 2024, the National Park Service contains 85 million acres. It is the most federally owned public land in the world, which is not hard to believe since we're one of the largest nations in the world. The park system is part of the federal government's U.S. Department of the Interior, and the NPS attempts to protect the many wonderful natural, cultural, and historical treasures that dot the American landscape. There are quote-unquote units of the NPS in all 50 states, in D.C., and all of the Empire's territories. There are currently 431 of these units, more than 150 related areas on top of that, and quite a few other lands set aside to be protected. The entire apparatus is a leviathan. These units include designations such as, obviously, the national parks, but also national monuments, national memorials, national military parks, historic sites, parkways, recreation areas, seashores, scenic riverways, and scenic trails. That was just a few. There are actually 19 of these naming designations. There's even an international historic site in Maine. Things like battlefields, mountains, forts, rocks, ruins, fossil sites, trees, buildings, and even the Statue of Liberty are all part of these protected areas. Now, it is extremely important that we have these, and for the most part, the NPS does a great job of preserving what they claim to protect. Again, the establishment of the national park system is a national treasure, one we should be extremely proud of. In 1832, the first rumblings of a desire to protect this land, they came from a future Smithsonian worker who was a naturalist and an exceptional painter. His name was George Catlin. And you should really check out some of his work. I'll have him up on the site. He's got awesome portraits of American Indians on the Great Plains. But in 1832, he got back from one of these trips out west, and he began suggesting to his buddies in D.C. that we should save what he saw was disappearing. He wrote that Americans should protect these treasures, quote, by some great protecting policy of government, in a magnificent park, a nation's park, containing man and beast, and all the wildness and freshness of their nature's beauty. End quote. He wrote entire volumes which were accompanied by beautiful paintings and drawings of the Indians and the bison and the land. He truly cared about protecting what he had seen during his extensive travels. But unfortunately, the Easterners weren't ready to hear his ideas quite yet. The thought of establishing a park never really took off from Catlin. The West was just too distant and foreign for people on the East Coast to care about at that time. But shortly after that, the painters and the writers, they slowly started filling people's imaginations. And then, of course, the California Gold Rush sent a slew of Americans west. And their letters and the descriptions of what they saw filled in even more gaps for the Americans on the eastern seaboard. The men that went out west, some of them, they were truly in awe of the beauty around them. By 1864, a senator in California was asking for a park to be established in Yosemite Valley. He wanted the incredible valley and the Mariposa Big Tree Grove of redwoods. He wanted them both to be protected. At that time, there were a few attempts at ranching and logging in the area, and he realized the beauty surrounding him, it needed to be protected. He wanted the state of California to run the area so that it could, quote, be used and preserved for the benefit of mankind, end quote. This senator's pleading was, apparently, important enough to the then president, Abraham Lincoln. I mean, despite Lincoln being in the middle of the greatest American tragedy, the Civil War, But Lincoln felt it was important enough to protect the valley and the redwood trees from being destroyed, despite at the same time facilitating the deaths of 600,000 of his own nation's people. But on June 30th, 1864, Lincoln signed the land of Yosemite and the redwoods over to the state of California. Lincoln, he said about this, he said the park will, quote, be held for public use, resort, and recreation, inalienable for all time. End quote. Inalienable for all time. I mean, that's a big deal. Only a few years later, in the late 1860s and early 1870s, the area of Yellowstone began to be explored. It was mostly explored by people seeking gold, but they immediately saw the territory as this pristine and incredible wilderness. A few of these explorers thought maybe it too should be preserved. Even the Northern Pacific Railroad Company, they began talking about a preserve around Yellowstone. Of course, they wanted it to be preserved as a destination for their rail travelers, but even they could see the significance. They understood its beauty. Because of these calls, by 1881, the Army had established forts at Yellowstone with the sole intention of protecting the land from miners and poachers. And I actually talked about this in my final Buffalo Soldiers episode. I'll put a link to that episode on this episode's page if you want to go take a listen. I also talked about the Army's control of Yosemite after it had been signed over to the federal government. And that too is covered in the last Buffalo Soldiers episode. And while we're on the topic of Buffalo Soldiers, they had a habit of creasing their hat in a certain manner, and that manner would eventually be adopted by the NPS as a whole, all the Rangers. The National Park Service would use that hat symbol until 2013. Thanks, Obama. In the eyes of many Americans, especially the ones who had seen the beauty of the West, by the 1880s and 90s, it became increasingly important to not only shelter natural landscapes, but also cultural ones as well. Specifically, the ruins of the Anasazi, ancestral Puebloans, the Hohokam, and others. Casa Grande in Coolidge, Arizona, was one of the first cultural areas designated a national monument. The destruction of tens of thousands of mounds in the East and the Midwest, I'm sure that played a role in wanting to protect these resources, but the push was mostly driven by the abusiveness and destructiveness of the pot hunters. These mostly Anglo men had no ties to the people who created the works of art, so they had no qualms with digging them up and selling them. It was an easy buck, after all. And an easy buck has defined American culture since before its founding. Eventually, the discussion around shielding these southwestern treasures led to the passage of the Antiquities Act of 1906. Famously, it was President Roosevelt that signed that into law, Teddy Roosevelt, and the law authorized the president, quote, to declare by public proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest. End quote. We will return to that problematic wording in a bit. Don't get me wrong, I believe Teddy had good intentions, but the good intentions have since been abused. After that legislation passed, between the years 1906 and 1916, Presidents Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson proclaimed 20 national monuments. Then, in 1916, Wilson signed the Organic Act, which officially created the National Park Service. The number of federally protected lands only exploded after that. Of course, FDR and his New Deal regime came in and reorganized the entire system to give a whole lot more control to the Federals. FDR also organized the famous CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, which essentially invented jobs for a whole bunch of unemployed men. On the one hand, the entire thing, the CCC, was quite silly. I mean, inventing jobs of ditch digging with spoons just to give people something to do. But on the other hand, it did stop a lot of vagrancy. It gave some men a purpose. And it ultimately built a lot of beautiful buildings, many of which still stand today, and many of which I love to visit. During their time, the CCC helped to guard and expand the infrastructure of the national parks. On account of that wording by Teddy Roosevelt, though, declared by public proclamation, aka presidential decree or executive order, because of that wording, it has been increasingly popular for presidents on their way out of office to steal away millions of acres from the states and give it to the empire. Really, beginning in the Reagan years, the park system ballooned with an enormous amount of land being acquired by the federal government, especially by Clinton and Barack Hussein Obama, specifically. Again, this is usually done on the way out of office, like it's one of the last things they sign into law after the election and before they're sworn out. I never really considered that this was a controversial thing, though, the establishment of the monuments. We have more public land, right? Isn't that great? We can go visit more spots. I didn't think it was controversial until I learned about the Bears Ears. If you didn't know, the unlawful declaration by Obama of the Bears Ears National Monument, it was quite the stir in the Southwest community, for both sides of the argument, for and against. And all of this drama happened when I was really deep in spending weeks out of the year in that area specifically, exploring the ruins, the canyons, seeing the petroglyphs, the pictographs. At first, I was all for the new designation and the enormous theft of land. I do think the Bears Ears needs protecting. I have seen things there that are unimaginably beautiful, but also quite fragile. Ruins 600 feet off the valley floor on the sides of cliffs. Petroglyphs that will blow you away. Ruins in crescent-shaped caves. Those particular ruins in the cave, they had a used baby's diaper discarded amongst the bricks in a fire pit next to empty beer cans and countless shell casings. Obviously, I want these things protected. They must be protected. Especially with the proliferation of the dreaded off-road go-kart style vehicle. I have many friends that have them, but I loathe them. I do understand their draw, though. But then again, regarding Bears Ears, I began reading articles from, like I said, both sides. I talked with locals. I read points of view from the Indians, the ranchers, and the residents. Suddenly, that acquisition of land wasn't so cut and dry. Did you know the federal government owns over 2/3 of the state of Utah's land? They own 70% of the state of Utah. How is that even remotely possible? Utah is a state. How does the federal government own that much of a state's land? Shouldn't it be left to the state to decide how more than 2/3 of its land should be used, should be ran? The combination of the Bears Ears and another favorite place of mine, my favorite place on earth, the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. The combination of the Bears Ears and Grand Staircase alone is a massive 1.3 million acres. The real problem arises when you realize the federal government, after declaring the land theirs, they then fail to supply adequate funding and resources to back up the wilderness's new title of monument. And that title's a big deal, which I will get to shortly. The whole Bears Ears affair eventually became, like seemingly everything today, quite partisan. Utah's Republican delegation said in 2022, quote, The vast size of the expanded Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monuments draws unmanageable visitation levels to these lands without providing any of the tools necessary to adequately conserve and protect these resources. End quote. And they're not wrong. Every single year I go to Grand Staircase and Bears Ears, and every single year there is more and more visitors. I'll just get into it now, actually. The title of these preservations, the title really matters. Going to a really pretty and unique spot in the forest or in the desert or in the mountains or the prairie, that is really great and everyone should go explore. But once you designate a spot, a monument, or worse, a park, people flock to it just because it's now called a monument or a park. People want the stickers, the stamps in their passport book, the souvenirs, the pictures at the entrance sign, or at the most visibly significant spot. They got to put it on the gram, TikTok. People want the ability to say, I've been there and I can prove it. I've been to such and such national park. I've been to such and such national monument. You should go. Take, for instance, White Sands National Monument in New Mexico. It became a national park in 2019. Attendance to the park in 17, 18, and 19, they were all roughly the same at just over 600,000 visitors a year. 2020 is an anomaly and therefore irrelevant, but in 2021, the numbers went from 608,000 people in 2019 to 782,000 in 2021. A nearly 30% increase once it became known as a national park. I visited White Sands in 2012, 13, and 14, and I was seemingly the only one there each time. That was once in the spring, once in the summer, once in the fall. The last time we went, last year, I took my family in 23. There was a line on the highway to pull into the park. This explosion of growth, it happens everywhere, not just at White Sands. This explosion of growth happens everywhere. There's a new designation. If you build it, they will come. Or for us, if you name it, they will come. I guess maybe designate it. With the naming and the designation, then comes the scourge of our modern era, social media. Now, I'm not proposing this, and you cannot, nor should we, attempt to stop citizens from taking pictures and posting said pictures on their various platforms, or writing about or recording videos or blogging. Does anyone blog anymore? But we can't stop civilians from doing any of that, nor should we. I would be very sad if that was the case, because my website would become worthless. My YouTube channel would not exist. No, I'm talking about the social media accounts of the NPS themselves. Arches has their own Instagram. I think every park has their own social media. The promotion of the parks by the Park Service themselves, it has to end. No more cute videos or sarcastic tweets written by a 20-year-old. No more Instagram accounts that highlight the beauty of the place that the NPS is supposed to be protecting. These posts, they only promote these places further, which brings more visitors. I believe the only social media presence the parks and monuments should have is like a morning post every morning about that day's weather or road conditions or events that are happening. No pictures, no TikToks of overweight, quote-unquote, rangers dancing at, let's say, Arches. When I was living in California in 2023, I wanted to know if a road in the southern Sierra Nevadas was open. It was a little early in the season, and that spring, it was even snowing in the spring. I wanted to know if the snow was on the road, if the road was open. I called not one, not two, I called 3 park rangers' offices. Now, these are national forests, but sentiment still stays. I called 3 park rangers' offices in the area, and not a single person could tell me the status of the road. Not a single ranger had driven out there or even heard a word about it. What are these rangers doing? Edward Abbey actually had an idea about what they were doing. And he said, "Put the park rangers to work. Lazy, scheming loafers. They've wasted too many years selling tickets at toll booths and sitting behind desks filling out charts and tables." Shouldn't these rangers be knowledgeable, incredibly knowledgeable, the most knowledgeable person about the area, the land that they work on and with and for? Too many rangers are obese or weak. But worst of all, they lack the essential knowledge. Speaking of Edward Abbey, in 1966, he wrote this also of the rangers, quote, "Put the park rangers to work. They're supposed to be rangers. Make the bums range. Kick them out of those overheated air-conditioned offices. Yank them out of those overstuffed patrol cars and drive them out on the trails where they should be leading the dudes over hill and dale, safely into and back out of the wilderness." End quote. Amen. They should be the hardiest of us all, like soldiers protecting our land. I heard a ranger at the very crowded Arches Visitor Center, not picking on this girl, but I heard a ranger just this year of 24 talking about her anxieties of crowds and her fear of heights. Ma'am, you're at the wrong place and you're in the wrong business. My wife and I were at the Grand Canyon in the spring of 23, and I wanted to know if we could, hike down to Skeleton Point on South Kaibab Trail. Not a single ranger I asked knew the conditions of the trail. Not one. We asked every ranger we saw. Eventually, thankfully, a woman behind the counter at the bookshop gave us the conditions. They were icy, dangerous, you'll need crampons, it isn't advised, you may not make it back up. I thanked her profusely before my wife and I walked back to my truck and marveled at what on earth was happening. What if we'd attempted that pre-dawn hike? I don't think that we would have been able to make it safely back up. We'd have to go all the way down to Bright Angel and all the way back up. And this will show my hand a little bit and my age, but there are way too many unprofessional looking rangers. Tattooed faces, purple hair, piercings through their cheeks, lips. These people represent the most beautiful and important parts of our nation, of the world. And they look like dysgenic freaks. Our park rangers should be upstanding citizens in peak physical shape that daily hike the trails, or at least drive the roads, or at a minimum spend their time learning and reading about the land around them. I will yet again quote from Edward Abbey. This is a great quote that my wife found for me. He's obviously talking about rangers like I am. Quote, "Many will not know how to saddle a horse, read a topographical map, follow a trail over slick rock, memorize landmarks, build a fire in rain, treat snakebite, rappel down a cliff, glissade down a glacier, read a compass, find water under sand, load a burrow, splint a broken bone, bury a body, patch a rubber boat, portage a waterfall, survive a blizzard, avoid lightning, cook a porcupine, comfort a girl during a thunderstorm, predict the weather, dodge falling rock, climb out of a box canyon, or pour piss out of a boot." Park rangers know these things, or should know them, or used to know them, and can relearn. They will be needed. End quote. And I sympathize with his view. And honestly, we should know all that stuff too. I'm tired of asking questions about the history of the area and getting a blank stare or I don't know. I'm admittedly quite knowledgeable because of how much I read, but shouldn't they know all the ins and outs of the entire park? The entire region that they're in? One of my listeners, and subscribers, Joel, a good friend of mine now. I met up with him in Santa Fe just last weekend. He gives private tours of the Southwest, and he is also very knowledgeable. He's a very smart guy. He put me to shame. He told me about his time not long ago at Yellowstone. He inquired about the floating limb that some park goers found in one of the hot spring pools. Joel told me this woman ranger said she'd never heard of that. He was flabbergasted. How have you never heard of that? He continued to push her like this was a big deal. It was international news. And she was oblivious. He kept asking and asking, and she finally relented and said, it's still under investigation. We can't talk about it. Okay. Why not start with that? Why lie? Even if she was told by her superiors to not talk about it, that's what you start with. You don't lie. Especially when you're in a place of power, like a ranger. The rangers work for us, for the land. They should be as kind and helpful and insightful as possible. We literally pay their salaries with our taxes. Well, kinda. When I first started really exploring and visiting the parks in the Southwest and the West, way back in 2014, it was a very different story. Not all the rangers, but some of the rangers really are night and day in comparison to now. I don't want to harp too much on the rangers. There are obviously still a whole lot of great ones. And a lot of very friendly and kind rangers too. And they always make my visit that much better. But they need to be the best of us. And also relating to the rangers, the visitor centers, they should be open from sun up to sundown. End of story. Except in Alaska, for obvious reasons. I'm tired of waiting for the building to open for an hour because I wanted to hike at sunrise, but I needed some information first. Or conversely, finishing a hike and heading to the already closed visitor center at 4 p.m. The rangers shouldn't have banker's hours. Heck, a lot of these centers are less than banker's hours. They should be up and open and ready to educate or help out at sunrise. And when the sun finally goes down, they can pat themselves on the back for a day well spent. That would also go a long way in weeding out some of the rangers. All right, rant about the rangers is over. Back to the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, which is absolutely my favorite place in this incredible country. It too needs to be protected. But that protection must be adequate. That protection must be done in a smart and efficient manner. I know smart and efficient is impossible with government, but that's why you leave these things up to the state, which yes is also a government, but it's a much smaller scale. It's more manageable. I first went to Grand Staircase back in 2017. My truck did not have four-wheel drive, so getting to the parking lot of one of the trailheads, a trail I was really excited about doing, getting to the parking lot was impossible. So I parked further away and walked. There was no real trail established at that time. There were no signs. You had to have a map and know how to read it. And you had to be prepared for steep descents, slippery sandstone, climbing around boulders, and making sure you didn't get lost. It was an incredible experience. But I still remember the woman, and I'm not being mean, but I still remember the woman who was crying because she couldn't descend the 4 feet from the sandstone to the sand, where her husband was waiting for her with open arms. She felt rimrocked, despite being completely capable of making the very tiny leap down to her husband's arms. I just walked around her, down the even steeper ledge before plopping down into the sand and walking off. I still heard her sobs minutes later, though. It was that kind of hike. So, in 2021, I took my wife to this same spot. I was all excited because now I had four-wheel drive, and I was so ready to use it. We got to the road for the turnoff for the trailhead, and I was surprised. there was signage. And then at the rough part of the road, where I got to use my four-wheel drive, the road was closed, and a new road had been graded. There was now a trailhead, an established trailhead, and an entirely new trail. There were no more steep spots for women to cry at. There were restrooms at the new trailhead, too. And the parking lot they built, it was packed. Surprise. I was there the exact same week, just 4 years earlier, and it had been only a few hardcore travelers, but now it was packed. People had their dogs going up sandstone slot canyons. People were blasting music. Trash was visible everywhere. If you build it, they will come. So the Park Service keeps improving trails and roads, adding signage, acquiring more property with the stroke of a pen, and then complaining that they need more funding to keep it all up. So they get the funding, and the cycle starts again. There was a rumor they were going to pave the hole in the rock road. Now, thankfully, I don't think that will ever happen. Well, I shouldn't say never. But it ain't happening right now. We need to be tearing up roads, making it so only dedicated people can reach these places. Probably on foot. We shouldn't be building any more roads. We should not be adding signage. And not creating brand new trails. Edward Abbey talks at length in Desert Solitaire about the problems of cars, or as John Muir put them, mechanical beetles. And Abbey had a great fix, too. He said, quote, "No more cars in national parks. Let the people walk, or ride horses, bicycles, mules, wild pigs, anything. But keep the automobiles and motorcycles and all their motorized relatives out." End quote. At first, I did not like this idea because I thought, well, that would suck. That would make it a lot harder to get to. That's a lot more walking. But now I am on board with the genius man. I mean, he mentions that you cannot appreciate the land from a car, and he's right. His quote is actually, "You can't see anything from a car. You've got to get out of the damn traption and walk. Better yet, crawl on hands and knees over the sandstone and through the thorn bush and cactus." End quote. He also goes on to say, quote, "Distance and space are functions of speed and time. Without expending a single dollar from the United States Treasury, we could, if we wanted to, multiply the area of our national parks 10-fold or 100-fold, simply by banning the private automobile. The next generation, all 250 million of them, would be grateful to us." End quote. There are over 330 million of us now. Again, he's onto something. For some places. This wouldn't work for all parks, like maybe the Grand Canyon, or Zion, or Rocky Mountain, although all of those do implement something I'm about to talk about. I mean, Joshua Tree even, although parts of Joshua Tree could also benefit from what I'm about to talk about. But those parks that have a single road in it, those roads should be closed to all visitors except those camping. You want to drive up Bryce Canyon or Arches or Capulin Volcano or any one of those places with a dead-end road? You can't. You park your car at the parking lot and you take a free shuttle, or you bike in with your pedal bicycle, or you hike. You crawl on your hands and knees over the sandstone and soil and rocks. I don't advise crawling over cactus. So Zion, like I said, does this in one segment of their park. Grand Canyon does this to South Kaibab. Rocky Mountain does this. Bandelier has a shuttle. It may be uncomfortable and annoying, but it would cut down the number of visitors. Think of how much better visiting hotspots would be if there were no cars, no looking for parking, no honking or music blasting, no exhaust. Obviously, the buses come regularly, like every 15 minutes for sure. And they come from an hour before sunup to an hour after sundown. at least again in the lower 48. The expansion of the roads, they began, of course, over funding, when the founding National Park Service Director Stephen Mather, Mather's Campground, but Stephen Mather, he was vying for power and funding with the head of the Forest Service. So Mather thought, I could bring a lot more people in if I had roads. And those roads have been the bane of the Park Service ever since. So a free shuttle system in parks, free, by the way, free shuttle system in the parks and monuments where it makes sense are a must. And probably at this point, inevitable, even without me as King of America. Although shuttles do have their own problem. In an article called Musings on National Park Crowds and Ed Abbey for the nationalparkstraveler.org, and I'm sorry, I did not see the author's name. But the author, writing in 2018, wrote, quote, Arches National Park, for instance, pledges, quote, to manage traffic congestion within the park while maintaining and improving public access, end quote. It has prepared an alternative transportation system and congestion management plan. Bureaucracy. Which suggested that for various reasons a shuttle system would be ineffective. Zion, Bryce Canyon, and Rocky Mountain National Parks have implemented shuttle plans with varying degrees of success in addressing their congestion problems. One difficulty with shuttles everywhere is when they drop numerous hikers off at trailheads. Trail congestion is the result. Shuttle tours might be too long for some, too short for others. The solution to one problem leads to another. I cannot go into detail here about what the Park Service has and is doing to address the crowding and congestion problems in its many units. Suffice it to say that the agency is wrestling with the problem, but is understandably hesitant to go as far as Ed Abbey suggested. End quote. Well, they shouldn't be too hesitant. And here's the last thing on cars. Sorry, Mom and Dad, and Mom and Dad-in-law. No more RVs. Period. Tent camping only. Obviously, the private land surrounding the park will explode with even more RV parks, but that's perfect. No tent camper ever likes sleeping near an RV. They're loud. The dogs inside them are always barking. And hearing someone's TV when you're staring up at the stars is infuriating. So no more road improvements. But also, no new improvements. Like I've already said, no new signage, no new roads, no new restroom. Actually, I think that we should have more restrooms at trailheads. But no new roads or signage, or promoting. Now, there is a caveat to no new improvements. If the NPS figures out a way to reduce cars or eliminate them from the parks, obviously improvements and modifications to the infrastructure will be necessary and welcome. It isn't just the improvements the Park Service makes that bother me and people like me. It's also the amount of land the Park Service is slowly blocking off. While I agree with making places more difficult for the average person to reach, I disagree with barring access to our wilderness. So many places are now inaccessible. Fences, signage saying, do not cross this line. So many public places I pay for with my entry fee and my taxes are now off limits to me. Remember the opening quote? A venturesome minority will always be eager to set off on their own, and no obstacles should be placed in their path. Let them take risks. Let them get lost, sunburnt, stranded, drowned. That is the right and privilege of every free American. Of course, there are backcountry permits, but they should be free and unlimited. Easier to get. Recently, I was going with another really great friend, who was also a listener before he was a friend. One of the great blessings of this podcast has been the friends I've made who are listeners. The friends I've made on the journey. Well, this friend, He lives in New Mexico, so I see him often. His name's Scott. We were going to go to Navajo National Monument to see the incredible Betatakin and Quetzal ruins. I have wanted to see them up close, touch them. I've wanted to be near them since I first laid eyes on Betatakin from the viewpoint. But you can't go see them unless you join a serious ranger-led hike. And this hike consists of overnight camping. But Scott and I were ready. Until the night before, or maybe 2 nights before, Scott calls me and he says he's been looking at the website. And it says they no longer allow the ranger-led, babysat hikers up onto the sandstone ledge where Quetzal sits, the ruins, the pueblo. You can no longer be near or amongst the incredible ruins. You just hike for 2 days, and you hike down to the ledge below, and you look up. I checked this out myself before calling and being told, yep, it's too fragile. For the ruins protection, we are no longer allowing people to see the ruins. So the NPS is going to protect them to the point of their worthlessness? What's the point of protecting something if you hide it away? This is so important we must not let anyone see it. But it is slowly being destroyed by the elements, so soon no one will see it. Make it make sense. And make no mistake, more and more of our public land is being blocked off and hidden away. Recently went on a hike with a friend here in New Mexico. He took me to Petroglyph National Monument. He grew up right there, rock climbing on the black volcanic cliffs. There were a brand new fence. I bet that fence had nowhere. It looked brand new. They probably put it up weeks before we got out there. And it said, you can't cross this line. We checked on one of those apps, and the land on the other side of the road was not private. It was part of the Petroglyph National Monument. I hope this doesn't get me in trouble. Obviously, we ignored that stupid brand new fence, and we just explored the black volcanic rocks and the petroglyphs ourselves. But that's what I'm talking about. And besides the brand new fences going everywhere, it seems like rangers discourage exploring. And this is a side note, but there are entire parts of the Grand Canyon that you'll be arrested for exploring. Won't get into those conspiracies, but they're fun to learn about if you ever want to look them up. The parks are becoming reluctant to allow wandering. More and more of them are being cordoned off and only accessible by tickets that you have to buy, you must pay for, on top of entry fee. And let's talk about that entry fee. I don't mean for this to just be a rant. I really do have solutions. But one thing that, let's say I'm declared dictator or first citizen of the United States for life or something. I'm elected King of America tomorrow. One of my first acts will be to declare that the national park system and everything affiliated, all those units, they are all completely free. Completely free to all American citizens. At the entrance, you prove you're a citizen of this incredible nation, and boom, the park is yours to enjoy. So, the park is free for all American citizens. I think a nominal camping fee is okay for the campgrounds with amenities. That's fine, but nominal, $15, maybe $20 at most. Watchman Campground in Zion National Park as of September 24th, 2024 is $45 a night. And that is outrageous. That's half a hotel room and you're camping. My wife and I recently paid, I think, like $37 for a national forest campground in southern Colorado. That is also crazy. And my wife and I were very lucky to do the fiery furnace tour. But why did I have to pay $10 extra a person to go do it? It's within the park. We already paid. But hopefully in the future, parks are free to American citizens. They should be. Now, of course, the biggest problems of the parks and monuments is the overcrowdedness, which I will address shortly. And obviously having the parks free would not lower visits unless my next suggestion is implemented. Free for citizens, Disney World prices for non-Americans. Each vehicle will cost a non-American well over $100, maybe even $200 depending on the park. Again, this will possibly show some of my leanings a little, which is something I tried to hide in my episodes. Although it is getting more and more difficult, the more comfortable I am publishing the episodes. But non-Americans, it seems, from my experience, simply do not respect the parks as much as the Americans that explore them. Of course, not all non-Americans. There is a certain baguette-loving nation in Europe that is probably more respectful of our parks than even Americans are. And yes, of course, some Americans are a-holes. But for the most part, from my extensive visitation, yes, I am part of the problem, but from my extensive visitation to the various parks, especially the big ones, some people from other parts of the world simply have no respect for our land. After all, it ain't theirs. Why would they? At Arches in 2022, I was standing in line for the restroom under Delicate Arch at the trailhead. When it came to my turn, it was a long line. A man exited the toilet and was walking off when I noticed he had completely missed the giant hole of the target. There was excrement lining the toilet lid. I yelled at him, and he turned around, but then he just kept walking. So I yelled for a ranger, who saw it and radioed it in, and then he went and talked to the guy. I don't know if he did. Everyone around me came to look, and naturally we were all disgusted. That is completely unacceptable behavior in this country, in our parks. Good Americans do not act like that. He was not an American. Crowds of tourists from other parts of the world often get off of buses and in their giant crowd take over an area completely. Trying to get to the viewpoint or enjoying the peace when there are people around you with no concept of personal space, that's impossible. They're there for the gram or to snap a pic or to put it on their Alibaba or whatever. They're not there to breathe it in, to enjoy it. In Yosemite, one of the greatest places on earth. My wife and I visited Yosemite just a few weeks before we got the heck out of California. It was like our last hurrah in the beautiful but completely ruined state. Obviously, because we know how to work the system, we woke up in the pre-dawn hours, got ready to hike, and began our hike before the crowds. Even then, the parking lot was getting full, but it was still peaceful and quiet and gorgeous. And the hike was absolutely awesome and filled with like-minded people and Americans. We hiked up to Vernal Falls. But on the way down, groups of non-Americans not speaking English, groups, 15 at a time, 22 a pack, they were walking up. They would not get out of the way. They had cell phones blaring out of their back pockets or their hands. They were holding music. And I saw one guy straight up just drop trash onto the path, on the trail. I yelled at the guy who littered, but he didn't hear me because of the music outside that he was blaring. Again, they were not Americans. And about outside music, the national parks would greatly benefit from a 24-hour, 365 days a year quiet hours. No speakers, not at your campsite, not on the trail, no cell phone music, no loud cars even. Your stupid rice burner sounds like a fart, you're denied access. Straight to jail. The point of being at the national parks, these pristine places, the point of being there is to enjoy and respect the ethereal beauty of the nature around you. Music is completely disruptive and rude. Those subject to the blasts of music are taken out of the monument, out of the moment, out of the park, and they're thrust back into urban life, which we're all trying to escape. At Valley of Fire back in 23, there was a gentleman with a speaker blasting rap. He was asked not by me, but by other people, to please turn off the awful music. It was quite loud. He was asked repeatedly, and he would just argue with everyone. He said it was a public place and he could do what he wanted. He turned it up at one point, before another, larger guy who probably also listens to rap, he implored him to turn off the sound or else. Now, he did turn it off, and this was happening 50 yards away, but it was over a vast sandstone area known as the Valley of Fire Wave. That sound traveled. People on the hike heaved a sigh of relief when the quiet came back. Nature came back. Especially, but not limited to, California, too many campsites are filled with people blasting music that has a repetitive trumpet beat. And that'll make you want to pull your hair out when you're sitting by a warm fire at your campsite, trying to lose yourself in the flames. Paying higher fees would discourage many tourists who are not American, who are not from this nation, who do not respect the God-given blessings that have been created around them. It would discourage many of them from visiting. So, quick comment about timed entry. I have a problem with it, but the current state of things, I guess it makes sense. And it's good that they don't require timed entry before sunrise and after sunset. My advice to all park goers is to just start your hike at sunrise. No one's in the park yet. It is quiet. You can watch the sunrise. Even if you have kids, they will on some level remember the sunrise over the sandstone arches or the deep crevice of the Grand Canyon. What the rangers at the gate should do, though, is form two lines. The two lines right now should be America the Beautiful Pass holders and Day Pass buyers. I am sick of waiting in line to enter a park, even though I've already paid for entry. Now, of course, in the future, when my changes are enacted, the two lines will be American citizens getting in free and non-citizens paying the high entry fee. Now, I'm sorry to still be complaining, but this complaint is a universal complaint, not just for the parks, but for everywhere. For God's sake, clean up after your dog, and do not leave the poop bag on the trail, you heathen. There's a sign on the fence of one of my neighbors that says, "There is no dog poop fairy." Just clean up after your animal. Be proud of the land you're exploring. Bag it, and take that bag and put it into another bag. And then put it in your bag. It's tough to imagine sharing this land in a world with people who pollute with physical trash, sound, and rudeness, cluelessness. Also, if the trailhead says no dogs, don't take your dog. That was a big thing in California I saw everywhere. Trailhead right there says multiple signs, no dogs, but people are either blind or don't care. I'm leaning towards they don't care since they're about to do a hike. And dogs are amazing. I love them, and I love my brand new dog, Elvis. I think dogs are literally man's best friend. But they aren't meant for all spaces. If there were 100,000 Americans, sure, take your dog. But there's almost 350 million of us who have an estimated 90 million dogs. Just leave your dog. I mean, not in the car, but somewhere with a friend or a family member. If it's a dog-friendly hike, please take them. It will benefit both of you, but if it ain't, don't just shrug and leash them up anyways. Which reminds me, hikers and wanderers, if they look inadequate to the task, the rangers, which I think should be peak specimens of America, the rangers, when they see an obese, waterless, or packless, unprepared hiker, they should be extremely proactive about educating that hiker on the dangers ahead. I'm thinking specifically of the Grand Canyon, where I saw hordes of ogres get off buses with nothing but a Gatorade bottle, and they were preparing to descend down the sheer walls of that wonderland. Sure, the Abbey quote in the beginning seems like it contradicts what I just said, but those people will fail at their task of hiking back up out of the Grand Canyon. And then our tax dollars will be there to bail them out with helicopters or mules when they can't make it back up. I mean, around 250 people get rescued out of the Grand Canyon every year. So the rangers need to be on point. Shouldered with that kind of duty and job of educating, I think the park rangers, because of that, they should be paid exceptionally well. I think they should be proud of their work and they should be rewarded for it. They should be fit and well-funded and ready to take on the elements that they are stewards over. And if they fail, they should be fired. Or their ranger buddies should learn how to bury a body. I really do appreciate the great rangers, though. I know there are some out there. But all of the rangers should be great. I briefly thought about mentioning the problems of the cartels in the parks and the forests, growing their marijuana and whatnot. I'm talking violent, armed, illegal, satanic militiamen with grow operations leaving mountains of trash. But that's not really something the MPS should be dealing with. My fix for that is for some such whatever of the million agencies we have. They should be flying drones armed with infrared cameras over the vast swaths of forest and public lands before sending in better armed than the cartel members, better armed American men to go take them out. Take them out was a poor choice of words there. Arrest and deport them. Or just imprison them forever. And while we're on the topic of armed men, this is a minor complaint, but it's a complaint that I think is important. Let me open or conceal carry my gun into the visitor center. The Second Amendment to the United States Constitution guarantees my right to the most basic, fundamental, God-given human right that exists. That is the right to defend my person and my loved ones. Not in that order. If we cannot defend ourselves against those who wish us harm, then we are not human. We are not a free people. The right to live is essentially being stolen from you. The right to own a weapon and have it with you was so important to the enlightened men who formed this nation that it was included in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights our founding fathers believed was so obvious that they stated they were given to us not by them, who were men, but by God. These buildings represent the American government and our greatest achievement, the national parks. Let us celebrate the foresight of our creators, God, and founding fathers to have guns on our hips. I'm probably going to lose a couple listeners with this rant-filled episode. And I keep thinking of more complaints, which I apologize for. I promise fixes are coming soon. This is the last complaint. But can we please stop renaming mountains and parks? If you've listened to any of my podcasts, you know I respect and enjoy learning about the American Indians' history and culture. But this land, which is also their land, is no longer only their land. I don't want to get too politically incorrect here, but also I don't care. The American Indians, for various reasons, mostly reasons that deal with horrible diseases and plagues and inferior weapons, but the Indians lost the half-a-millennia war against their European invaders. It's hard to fight for your survival when you lose 90% of your population to an unknown virus with which you have no immunity for. But the Indians lost, and the Anglo-Americans, with some ex-slaves and a few Europeans, conquered the vast territory of the current United States. Heck, we conquered the vast territory of Mexico, but we gave a good portion of that back. American founding stock are not new to this form of humanity, taken over through war. Now, we are one of the last ones to get away with it, for sure. But our European ancestors lost their war to the Ottomans, and now much of Greco-Roman Christian territory is inhabited by steppe people invaders. The hunter-gatherers in Europe, they lost to the Indo-European invasion of our Anglo ancestors. The Apaches conquered vast swaths of Humano-Mogollon territory before they were kicked out by the Shoshone Utes and Comanches. And can you picture an Apache saying, "I apologize for that conquering. We're going to name our rancheria after you Puebloans," or whomever. "We're going to call it place where our enemies used to call the big mountain where the mountain lion rests atop the rock." That's how the Apache named things. But no, they would not do that. They're going to continue to call their rancheria the place where the big cottonwood comes from the spring. Stop renaming our peaks and our ranges and our parks and our land our history, which we fought and died for and conquered. Stop renaming our land the local tribe's name or whatever they used to call it. The local tribe, which for all we know had only just conquered it from someone else. The story of humanity is the story of movement, the story of migration, the story of war. We should be proud of our land, and the NPS has no business renaming a single spot on the map. Definitely going to lose listeners on that one. And now I'm done with complaining. That was a lot of complaining. I really apologize. I was pretty negative. But I talked about the problems, and I talked about a lot of the fixes. These fixes would really help the parks be a much better space than they already are. But how on earth would I fix the growing visitation numbers? I mean, besides ending the nonstop improvements and promoting, while also limiting access. It's very simple, actually. I did not make this up, and I have now forgotten who I heard it from or where I read it, unfortunately. Or I would absolutely give them credit. But the fix: you cycle the parks and monuments between the two designations. You demote a park to a monument, and you elevate a monument that already has the infrastructure in place. You elevate those monuments to a park. You do this for a cycle of 5 or 7 years. Heck, even some of the monuments can be demoted down to BLM land or National Forest land. And BLM is Bureau of Land Management, not the terrorist organization of grifters. The federally protected land, no matter its designation, would obviously still have all of the legislative and legal protections. Nothing would change with that. They will still stay protected and beautiful and free from encroachment by corporations or citizens or tribes. But simply the fact of demoting a park to a monument and demoting a monument to BLM land, that would drop visitation. The allure would be gone. The prestige of visiting such and such national park, that would wane over time. The promoting of the parks by the uber popular social media accounts would drop. Of course, there will always be the check out this totally off the grid spot that no one knows about channels, or the 10 places you must visit before you die listicle posts. Are listicles even a thing anymore? For the vast majority of tourists, both citizen and non-citizen, if you've got a bucket list of TripAdvisor approved places to go see, the once park now only monument drops down the list. Or the once monument now BLM managed spot disappears. You couple this with giving many of the parks and monuments back to the states, and visitation drops. Look at the state parks, say in Utah, that surround the national parks. They're nearly empty. Of course, the feds must use the words of Lincoln, the words of it being held by the state for public use, public resort, and public recreation for all of time. He was right about that. If the land's held by the state, the 50 states, not the federal state, but if the state holds the lands for public usage for all of time, lest they get penalized by lack of funding or what have you by the feds, I mean, if the empire gives the land back to the states with the promise of very punitive punishments for not keeping the land pristine and public, the states would comply. States need funding. Cities need funding. I mean, the fact that cities need funding is why we see so many small towns in enormous amounts of debt, accept jet loads of non-American illegals. Money runs everything. The American empire will be around, I don't know, another 100 years at least, more probably, before it eventually does whatever the future has in store for us. But for our current epoch, the promise of federal funds to keep those lands in trust will go a long way. And then once history has her way with the United States, the words for all time, I think that they would make a difference in the conscious and zeitgeist of the elected stewards of the state-owned land. There is no libertarian or anarchist view of the future that will ever succeed. There are too many Americans, and the federal state is too entrenched in everything from the local to the regional level. Plus, now we have nuclear weapons. The world is fundamentally different. It's a lot different than the one that your favorite authors wrote about in the late 18th and 19th century. Plus, we abhor anarchy. The original protectors of this land, the men who set up the national park system in the first place, they may have been progressive for their time, but they are men of the right. They are men who value their neighbors, their nation, and our God. They are men that understand the evil of government and corporations, their evil to exploit, but even still they felt that they could protect our natural and cultural resources via legislation and by the backing of the barrel of a federal gun. If you've made it this far, I assume you're at least adjacent to my beliefs, so I'm going to say, if you're still listening, fight for our public lands. Fight for the protection of our land. We must stop the building of massive wind farms, which kill an average of 1.2 million birds a year. 1.2 million birds a year. I know someone who works for the wind farm here in New Mexico. Sure, it's in the middle of nowhere, but it is, according to the developers themselves, this wind farm, the Sunzia Wind and Transmission Farm, it's the largest in the entire Western Hemisphere. They're still building it. Imagine the numbers of birds this wind farm is killing. But at least it's giving power to millions of New Mexicans, right? Wrong. The largest wind farm in the Western Hemisphere is being built to give energy to California. California. 2 states over. All the migratory birds are going to kill in New Mexico for power in California. They have a 550-mile line that will go from the transfer station through our wilderness to California, a state with infinite resources. And they could benefit from nuclear, too. They're destroying our land for their consumption. But it gets better. This same company is also building a massive wind farm in Wyoming, which is also, all of it, every gigawatt, will be going to California. Want to know how much destruction of soil and concrete every single bird-killing, cancer-causing wind turbine needs? They require an 80-foot diameter reinforced concrete foundation. The foundation requires a volume of 850 to 900 cubic yards of concrete. You have 200 windmills, that's enough for an enormous skyscraper. How much steel rebar to enforce the concrete, you may ask? The amount of rebar in every single foundation is 40 to 60,000 pounds. Well, concrete, that's fine, you might think. You just mine it or something, right? Concrete is made of 3 things: aggregates, or sand and pebbles, water, and cement. Now you're probably thinking, great, we got a lot of all of that. You'd be wrong. First of all, we're running out of the good kind of sand, and for the past few years we've been importing sand, which is hard to imagine, but it's true. Secondly, water. Water is the most important resource in the world, and it is very scarce in the desert and Great Plains of New Mexico. We don't have a lot of it here, and my neighbor's wells over in Edgewood are drying up. Obviously, that's scary for us. I think we're okay, but we can ship in water from the Great Lakes, I guess, until we can't. But cement. That is the ingredient that is the most upsetting, and which every single wind turbine uses a vast amount of. Surprisingly, the United States is by far the largest cement importing country. We import it from Turkey, a nation halfway across the world that may be in NATO but is against all of our national interests. So there's Turkey, Canada, Mexico, Vietnam, and Greece. We are importing cement from possible future enemies, communists, hostile neighbors, and, the neighbor above us. If our two neighbors got cement to export, don't we got cement to make? I think I've hammered that point home. I know this is no longer talking about the parks, but it is talking about the preservation of our land, which the parks do. But there's more going on that is upsetting that I want my listeners to know about. The LA Times, the Los Angeles Times, they're currently reporting on the soon-to-be-built Aratina Solar Project, which will be built in the Mojave Desert of Southern California. This project will see, it almost makes me cry, kid you not. This horrendous, ugly, dust-creating project of blindingly disgusting solar panels, lanes of them, rows of them. This Aratina Solar Project will kill 4,700 Joshua trees. My wife and I got married in Joshua Tree. Our photo shoot was in the national park, actually. I love Joshua trees. I love them almost as much as I love saguaros. Did you know Joshua trees used to spread their territory via giant ground sloth droppings? The giant ground sloths would eat the flowers and then poop out the seeds. So, obviously, for the last 15,000 years or more, the Joshua tree's habitat has been shrinking. There's no one alive, nothing alive, to spread the territory. Of course, the grifters say this is because of human-made climate change, garbage, blah. But this green, can you believe they call themselves green? This green company will cut down 4,700 Joshua trees to build a solar plant. You ever driven past a solar plant? There's one on I-15 from LA to Las Vegas near the Nevada border. It is some sci-fi garbage. Straight out of Blade Runner. It is hideous and blinding. I will read you some quotes from the LA Times article. Quote, "How are kids going to be able to play outside?" asked Melanie Richardson, a nurse who has sons at schools near the site. "So many people from our community were begging them not to approve this project, and they passed it regardless." End quote. Here's another one. "Let's destroy the environment to save the environment. That seems to be the mentality," said Derek English, who teaches at Barron Senior High School. "It's hard to comprehend." End quote. Let's destroy the environment to save the environment. Give English an award. He is spot on. As Americans, creators of this revolutionary national park system, believers in defending the defenseless, as Americans who want to see the world cleaner and healthier, we have to fight against this lie, this garbage. And part of that will be to defend our national parks from the encroachment of the regime and the confiscation of state lands, coupled with the expansion of the NPS system. Now I sound like English. We have to protect the national park system by stopping it from expanding. This episode derailed a little bit, but we can fix the parks. We can fix our land. We can fix our future. Let's make the public land more accessible to Americans. Let's make the public land quieter and cleaner. Let's make the public parks free for Americans while improving the competency of the rangers and the bureaucratic leaders who guide them. We need to possibly defund the parks a little bit to stop their usage of social media, rotate the parks and the public lands through stages which would dissuade visitors only visiting for the likes and the stamps. We must return to a high-trust society where all Americans share similar values and similar goals for the future of this nation and of our beautiful land. Return the pride of land to the right. Return the protection of our land to people who value the nation more than other nations. This nation is a place with history and heritage, not just a country with magic soil that turns every immigrant into an American. We are a people with shared past and a shared hope for the future. Many people being illegally allowed into our borders right now do not share our values or appreciation of the land. There is a certain group of them, being shot straight into the vein of Americana who couldn't give two hoots about public land. They go to public parks, they kill the migratory birds, the ducks and the geese, the creatures we take our children to see, to feed. These people fish illegally in our streams and our lakes, not with poles or rods, but with nets. They are destroying our homeland like they destroyed theirs. My friend Joel, he said something quite profound the other day. Regardless of what you believe about the biblical story of Adam and Eve, whether you think it's just that, a story, or whether you think it's historically fact, Adam and Eve were not in the Garden of Eden being all laissez-faire. They weren't letting nature, quote-unquote, take its course. No, they were tending to the gardens, the forests, and the animals. They were naming them and keeping the land ordered. We are creatures of nature, yes, but we are also creatures of the Lord. We are children of God. We must keep His land that He gave to us. We must keep it orderly. We have to protect what is around us. One of my favorite things I've learned throughout my readings for the podcast is the description the English settlers to North America, the description they gave to the land when they saw it. They said the forests were like parks. Trees abounded, but grass was beneath the trees. The bushes and thorns and what my French friend calls trees, they were absent. The land was often described as a Garden of Eden, a paradise. Occasionally, seasonally planted corns and melons sprouted up near fallen trees, but the American landscape, before Europeans, was described as being a park. That's because the American Indians were seasoned stewards of the earth. They burned the landscape nationwide, continent-wide, hemisphere-wide. When disease hit the American Indians after contact, and upwards of 90% of them died, hemisphere-wide, the burning stopped. It's been speculated this stoppage of burning could have contributed to the Little Ice Age in Europe in the 17th century, which itself contributed to greater colonization in the Americas to escape the famine. But that's how much the American Indians continued the fabled Adam and Eve's cultivation of the land. The world by itself is chaos. We, as humans, especially Americans, we are order. We were put here by Heavenly Father to be orderly, to look after this world, His world, to learn to take care of our world, so that maybe one day in the afterlife we may have our own. The national park system is the greatest thing the American experiment has yet to create. We must value it and keep it strong. We have to celebrate it and protect it, but also all of our land. This is ours. We own it. We must protect this nation's beauty with our lives. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.